Okay, here we go. Welcome to the Believe Again podcast, powered by Parable Bookkeeping and Accounting, with your host, Josh. And now I'm so happy to include Amy Roberie.
That's right. I am joining this season of the Believe Again podcast. And on this show, we discuss the challenges and triumphs of ministry, offering hope and practical insights for pastors and leaders everywhere. Our goal is to explore the heart of what it means to believe again and lead well in every season of ministry.
Well, today we're discussing a topic that it's sometimes a struggle to discuss. It was even hard for me to really write, but it's the topic of depression. So depression, or major depressive disorder, is a common yet serious mental health condition that affects millions, including those who serve in ministry. It's characterized by persistent feelings of sadness, loss of interest in activities, and difficulties in daily functioning. In ministry, the weight of depression can be easily heavy, impacting not just the individual, but their families and their faith communities. Amy, as an Enneagram 7, how did it feel for you to hear all those heavy words right off the bat?
It's a challenge, but I'm here for it.
Okay, but that's what we're going to do. We're going to jump into this crucial talk. I'm going to be sharing a lot. Amy's going to be asking me some questions about it because of my journey with depression. But I think it's important for us to talk about this. There's unique pressures that ministry leaders face. And I think when we address these, we not only live healthier lives, but we're more effective as leaders. So whether you're a pastor, a leader, or someone who supports those in ministry, or really anyone that's a believer that has faced this illness, we hope this conversation will shine light on the importance of mental health and provide some practical steps towards healing. But before we dive in, why don't we go into a little bit of a lighter topic? And I'm going to ask you, Amy, since you're new to the being permanent host, you've been on each season, I think, at least once. But let's find out a little bit about you. So I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
I want to find out maybe about a hobby that you have that maybe might surprise everybody else. And then I'm going to tell you, I'm going to pick a different hobby and talk about it. And then you're going to ask me the same thing. Okay. So why don't you tell them about a hobby you have that might surprise them, or maybe not a lot of people know about?
Well, I think a lot of people probably know, but my biggest hobby that I'm into, that I follow, that I might be slightly obsessed with is football. And it started out just being college football, but over the years, it's also now begun to be the NFL as well. So I do love it. It's fun. And, it's kind of bled into like baseball and some other things too.
Yeah, you're really into college baseball now.
But sports in general.
Yeah, and I think most people would say, hey, Josh is living the dream. He got a beautiful wife. She loves sports. But imagine that dream going to such an extreme that it's actually a distraction. So that's where it's at now. She's more into it than me for sure. And okay, I'll mention a hobby that you have, and is when we first got married, the best thing you made for dinner
was out of a box.
Well, reservations.
Yes, true. But everything I cooked came from like
out of a box
or a frozen like something. Frozen,
and then
the frozen section.
When we left our ministry job in Baton Rouge for 2 years, you stayed at home, and then eventually you went back to work. But I guess for like a year and a half, year or so, you were at home, and you love watching Food Network, and you became the best cook that I could ever.
I don't think I'm the best, but I did get an interest, and I had time on my hands.
And I think that's your hobby, because the love and the attention to detail that you put in your cooking goes beyond just making a good meal. Last night you made chicken boggin. You put the little green onions on there to add a little color and flavor, and you always put a little handmade gourmet touch on your food. So I think cooking is actually a hobby of yours.
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree. What about you, Josh? What's a hobby that you have that not many people know about?
I think a hobby that I have that not a lot of people know about is gardening.
Oh, yes, that's true. And you love to garden.
I love to garden. It's come a long way. When we first got married, I remember you came out in the yard, you saw I'd cut some bushes, and you started crying because you didn't trust or believe. And I really didn't know. I was ignorantly out there just slashing away at these bushes. But I like doing landscaping, and we've always had small yards, and now we have a giant yard, and it's kicking my butt. But it's something we kind of do together, because I do the landscape, but you supervise and you interject.
I am the supervisor of all of our home projects, for sure.
Yes.
indoor or outdoor.
Whether I want you to be the supervisor or not.
That's right.
Okay. All right. So that's a little bit, about our hobbies or whatever. And, but let's talk about something a little bit more serious, and that is ministry and depression. I read a book recently, When Darkness Is My Closest Friend, which again, I know is Enneagram 7. You probably would never pick that book up. But I was doing some research for this episode, and I found a book on ministry and depression. And it's from this pastor who deals with depression. I was just looking for quotes and research, but it was really good. And the reason why I liked it so much is because basically it wasn't about fixing depression. It was more about describing what it's like, and which really helps someone like me that deals with it. And also, I think it helps people who doesn't deal with it maybe understand how to interact and deal with people who deal with depression. And so I'm going to be referencing that book throughout this conversation.
What's the name of the book again?
When Darkness Is My Closest Friend.
Okay.
And so it sounds like, oh, how could it? But it's actually, that's a part of a scripture. So that's taken from the Bible, that statement. And so that's where it came from. But one thing I wanted to start off with is kind of like a definition I shared earlier on depression, but another one that's from Rosalind Clark in Stafford, UK. And she says, anyone who has suffered with mental ill health will know that not an insignificant part of the problem is the inability to explain it. The words don't work to convey the reality of the experience to those who have never been in that particular pit. And when I read that, I was like, oh my gosh, that is exactly it. Because I always feel like I have a hard time explaining it, and I doubt the way that I experience it is the same as everyone else.
Right.
I know my depression is very unique, because people can hardly tell. I was having very much depressed feelings today, and I doubt anyone knows. Sometimes you can tell though, and we'll talk about that when those feelings start sinking in. Amy, you went into like a little deep thought there. You're watching.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about how hard it is for you, especially at first, early on in that journey, to explain how you were feeling to me, especially when I would still see you function in some daily tasks and activities. But for you to adequately be able to convey some of the feelings that you were experiencing. And now, though, we've been married 17 years, I I can pick up on it, and I can see even just maybe by the way sometimes you might be walking first thing in the morning around the house, and I can tell. And so it's interesting.
Yeah, I'm
like
always like, how does she know? How does you're like, how are you feeling right now? And I'm like, how do you know? I'm not even talking or doing anything.
Yes.
But yeah, there's definitely, and I've become more self-aware. I mean, that's part of the problem, right? Is I don't think people are even aware they're dealing with depression. I think that I have some anxiety. No, bro, you're dealing with something. And we'll talk about that more in just a second.
Yeah. So why is it important to talk about ministry and depression?
Well, I think there's 3 reasons why it's important to talk about ministry and depression. One is the statistics bear out that it's affecting people.
Right.
Secondly, I think that if it goes unaddressed, it impacts you, your family, your faith community, and the larger church at large in a bigger way than you can ever imagine. And then finally, because of my own experience. And so I guess like one of the things I'm looking forward to in this podcast is, for years, I've wanted to talk about this. I wanted to find the right way, the right time to do it. And of course, there's always a stigma whenever you talk about, hey, I deal with mental health. I know there is, and I know that once I tell people about this, they're going to look at me differently, and that's fine. But I think it's just really, really important to share this, and I'm looking forward to diving into it a little bit more. So the statistics.
Yeah, research indicates that a significant percentage of people in ministry experience depression. Studies have shown that about 23 to 28% of pastors and ministry leaders have reported dealing with some form of depression. This rate is higher than what is comprised of the general population. So that means there's a higher rate of people who are pastors or ministry leaders experiencing depression in their daily life. This is likely due to the unique pressures and challenges associated with pastoral work, such as emotional burdens, isolation, and the constant demands of leadership.
So people would say, well, pastoring's not hard. You read the Bible, you pray, you go eat lunch with people. But the thing about it is one of the things that psychologists have found is that it's more traumatizing for you to experience someone else's trauma than it is your own. Because when it's your own trauma, there's these mechanisms that kick in to to
Right, the
protect
way that
yourself.
God's created our bodies and the responses that happen, even the hormones that are released when you're in flight or fight hormones, even that are released in trauma, but you don't have that in a secondary way when you're
Right.
hearing it.
And so that's something pastors are dealing with. The other thing that I would say it's important to talk about this is because when someone is carrying wounds that are not healed, sometimes they seek to cover those things up in ministry, and they find acceptance. And I'll share a little story. When I was at LSU, there was a guy, and you can just really tell that he struggled with acceptance. He was always looking for attention. And I remember one day he told everyone at our table that we were eating at in the LSU Union that he was going to become a youth pastor. And the guy was like, he smokes, he cusses, he drinks. He was doing everything he could to fit in. I mean, I never heard him talk about God. And then something clicked in my mind. I was like, I know why he wants to be a youth pastor, because he thinks if he becomes a youth pastor, he'll have everyone looking at him and he'll finally be the cool guy. And he was going into ministry and being driven by desire to be liked. And I didn't realize that I was actually doing the same thing at that time and wasn't even aware of it. And so I wanted to ask you about that. And I'm going to read a quote from the book, but
I think it's one of those both and situations where I do believe that people, I think the majority of people in ministry, pastors and leaders alike, are pursuing that because they're being obedient to the call that God's placed on their life, and they're pursuing that call, and they feel a genuine love for God and a genuine love for people, and both and there's also those wounds that have not been dealt with in their life, and they don't realize that what starts out as answering a call in obedience and passion and love for God and people turns into then using that ministry to then heal those wounds, to gain acceptance, to gain love back to them, to feel like they are something that they never felt before.
and I think there's been other Chuck DeGroat and other people have talked about this, the
Absolutely.
draw of it, and it's something that we need to be aware of, and it's something that I wasn't aware of for a long time. It was part of my story, and I think Mark Meynell, who wrote the book When Darkness Is My Closest Friend, he said something about that, and he summed it up better than I could. So I'll just read what he says. He says, "This brings real danger to anyone in pastoral work. If my shame, which shame and guilt and past hurts is what causes depression. If my shame has caused such profound instability, it's perhaps inevitable that we attempt to heal the wounds by cultivating the love and acceptance of the people we serve, if only to prevent future assaults." Another person talks about this is John Eldredge, and basically what we do is we put on a performance. Other people have called it adaptive behavior.
That's right.
Where you overachieve to protect yourself. And that's specifically what I was doing. Was I was overachieving to find acceptance and to protect myself from rejection. And so everyone around was like, man, look, Josh is more gung-ho than everyone else, more driven. It was adaptive behavior. I didn't take my shame and guilt and wounds and internalize it and say, and try to avoid people. I said, no, I want to be in the spotlight. I don't want to be rejected. So I'm going to overachieve so that I never get rejected again. And you've known me since we were teenagers. What do you think when I say that looking back?
Well, it totally makes sense to me. And again, I would say it's a both and, because I also recognize from early on, I think I was 16 when I first met you. You were 16 as well. And there was a pureness about your heart for the Lord and your drive to pursue him and to know him and to make sure that other people knew him. And that was a purity that you had in you. At the same time, there was some deep wounding that you probably weren't even aware of, or you might have been aware of on a very surface level.
Mm-hmm.
But that stemmed from your early childhood, and that would kind of continue on in your childhood and early adulthood, and coming from family trauma. And I think as you experience those things again, everything that we can do that can start out as pure, there's always that opportunity where the enemy is real. He will come in and he will use those things. If we don't continue to pursue healing in them, he can use those things to derail us. And
Right.
that's really what I see when I think about that, is that the enemy tried to use that to derail you, to be focused on performance, focused on being driven to achieve certain goals, to even become slightly legalistic, in your achievement of those things, of achievement of maybe perfection almost.
Yeah, and I think it's very messy, and like you
Yeah.
said, it's for me there was this genuine pure call to God. I mean, there's a sensitivity I've had to God since a young child that I know just comes from Him. But it was the grace of God. But where it got messy was there would be a point where it's like, okay, you've done your Bible study, you've read your Bible for the day. Why is there 100 more things that you think that you need to do?
You put a pressure on yourself,
right?
That you haven't accomplished enough, or there's more to be done, or I haven't achieved enough. And again, that's going back to speaking to that wounding that
and that's what concerns me about a lot of people in ministry. When people brag about not resting, when people always have to be on the road and it's like unnecessarily traveling, it concerns me, because I don't judge them, because I know that everyone's got their own journey. But I just reflect on me knowing that, okay, why can't you rest? Because I know why I've had problems resting before, and it's not connected to the call of God and all that. It's connected to a bunch of bad stuff. And to this day, I have trouble resting. I do a lot better with it because you help me and I'm aware of it. But I think we need to, Sabbath and put God back in His place. Okay, so let's read a little bit more of this quote here. But not only is this flawed, because this is again from When Darkness Is My Closest Friend. Because such acceptance can only be limited, it is also highly damaging. Our service of others can only become a cover for our own self-service, and an extremist generates what the psychologist calls codependency. I've seen it over and over and over again in ministry, experienced it myself, created it myself, and I see it even in healthy churches, that leaders create a codependency with the people that they follow, and I see it in families. I've seen it in my family,
absolutely.
And what happens is, when codependency, when you're a leader, is I'll just read what Mark said. He says, "I need others to be pastorally needy so I can meet those needs. Consequently, I have no real incentive to see them heal, but inadvertently sustain their dependency on them." And so what happens is we don't want people to grow beyond us, because we want them to need us. And that's where sometimes it's hard to let people go. And it's actually very damaging. So, okay, we've hit that one pretty good. So let's move on. And then, of course, my own experience in ministry has been influenced by depression. I've battled depression for varying degrees for as long as I can remember. Not that I was aware of it all those times.
But now looking back, you can see.
And looking back, I can see. And, for example, I remember, I draw. So I do painting and art. Another hobby.
It's one of your hobbies.
Yeah, I really have a collection of hobbies.
Quite a few hobbies, yes.
But I've drawn since I was in elementary school, and I've kept every drawing I've ever done, basically. And I have art journals. And I remember going through an art journal when I was in high school and showing I had done a self-portrait.
This is something you drew in high school as a teenager?
Sketched in an art journal, and I showed it to you. I went through this in 2020. We were all stuck at home. And I was starting to get into art again. And it was a self-portrait, but what was crazy about it, and it's kind of shocking to say out loud, was that I had drawn a hole in the middle of my chest.
I remember that.
And you could see right through my chest. And it's like something was telling me, hey, something's not right.
How old do you think you were when you drew that?
17 or 16 years old.
And this is someone who was, again, I knew you, that was passionate about the Lord. Reading your Bible every day, praying every day, leading students like myself and many other students to follow Christ. And
and that's part of the problem.
That hole was there, though.
That's part of the problem why it goes undiagnosed, and it was undiagnosed in our church for a long time, is because, I remember my dad telling me that if people just got the Holy Ghost, they wouldn't be depressed. They need the joy of the Lord. And that was part of our theology, was this. But it's so much more complicated. You need the spiritual side. And that's part of what I've learned, is learn to manage the spiritual side of things, as well as several other things. There's emotional things that were going on.
Are you a church planner navigating the complexities of starting a new ministry? Parable understands your journey, because their founders, Greg and Jessica Daly, were once in your exact shoes. They know the unique challenges and financial stress you face as a ministry leader, and they are here to help.
With Parable, you can get free accounting services leading up to your launch, so you can focus on what matters most, building your church and reaching your community. Join the many church planners who trust Parable to handle their finances with care and expertise. Visit liveyourparable.com/believeagain to learn more and get 25% off your onboarding fees.
So Josh, when did you first realize that depression was impacting your life?
Well, honestly, it wasn't because I saw I was depressed. I had no thoughts of being depressed whatsoever, through high school and even college. But basically, my father, it was through my dad. So
Mm-hmm.
my dad grew up in an alcoholic, abusive home. My grandfather physically abused him and my grandmother,
Mm-hmm.
to the point that one day my dad pulled a gun on his dad and said, "If you hit mom again, I'm going to kill you."
Mm-hmm.
And so he had to leave. He was smart. He was brilliant. He's so smart, but he had to drop out of high school and began working in the fast food
So
industry.
he left his home because it
Left his
wasn't
home
safe for him
because
to
it
be
wasn't
there.
safe. And eventually he joined the military, got his GED. But he always watched him, basically struggle through life as someone who was capable of so much more. But because of a decision he made at 16, 17, and I just would always think about how his life would be different if he was able to continue high school, go to college.
But he really had no choice.
Had no choice.
He was in a...
The choice was made for him.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I didn't realize how much that was impacting him his whole life until
Right.
he had 3 marriages. His third marriage, he loved his wife,
Yeah.
but they had some financial struggles, and basically she threatened to leave him. And when she told him that, he overdosed on 90 prescription migraine headache pills, and would have died if he didn't call 911 and save his own life. So he saved his own life.
So after doing that, he immediately regretted that.
He took it, and so it's basically called a moment of indiscretion. It's not called an attempted suicide because he immediately tried to save his life. It was very creepy, but one day he played for me the 911 recording. And so I know I listened to him and how they instructed him and what to do in that moment. And he passed out. You could hear him on the 911 recording hit the floor, and they saved his life, but he was handicapped.
He was never the same.
He was disabled from that day forward.
Yeah.
And
because the effects of that, body,
right. And so then he was diagnosed as clinically depressed. And
was that the first time him making that decision to take that medication to end his life, but then quickly saying, no, I don't want to do it? Was that the first time that he realized truly that he was clinically depressed, and the first time he was diagnosed with a mental health situation?
Right.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah.
And so
but you can look back and see it was affecting him long before. Yeah.
And so he was officially disabled. He could no longer work. He went from almost like a military clean house.
Yes.
Perfection.
I remember that. Yeah.
Everything was perfect. The finances were perfect. Him and his wife had only been married. I don't even think they were married. 8 years or whatever, but their house is about to be paid for.
Yeah.
They're just a few $1,000s away from literally everything being completely paid for, money saved, retirement, everything, to complete disaster. The house was never once clean again. There's no financial stability ever again in his life or my life. And she left. When she left, she took things out of the house. I remember I came home from school and my bed was gone. I'm like, because it was her bed.
From school, it was from LSU.
From LSU,
right?
I was a freshman at LSU, and I'm like, okay, I don't have a bed to sleep on now.
Yeah.
And my dad's in the hospital. I'll talk about that maybe another time, more detail. But basically, for the next 9 years, my dad would be checked in and out of mental institution, Baton Rouge, called the Tall Center. And the reason why I'm sharing that's important is because that's part of why I could never admit I was depressed.
Well, and I think even then, because I knew you during, again, that whole time. It goes back to our teenage years, and even in our dating and then our early marriage while he was still alive, I never would have thought. It's not, you're saying you could never admit to yourself that you were depressed, but I never would have thought that early on at all.
And I think the
that
problem
thought never crossed my mind, honestly.
When things would come up, and there was lots of signs that we'll talk about.
Yes.
But
looking back now, I see it. But in that moment, I never once thought that.
But part of the barrier for me was the spiritual or misunderstanding of spirituality, that I couldn't be depressed because I had, like my dad said, had the Holy Ghost.
Yes, right.
And
that's probably what I was thinking
admit
too.
some flaw in my faith, and that was part of our theology that was very wrong. This perfectionist faith that if I had faith, everything would be perfect in my life, which is so toxic and dangerous. But the other part of it is that I could never admit that I was depressed, because to admit that would be admit to the level that my dad was, that he was in the Tall Center for Thanksgiving. And on Thanksgiving, I'm driving up to the mental institution in Baton Rouge with my grandmother.
Yes.
And visiting my father. and wondering, how did this happen? And so I couldn't admit it because I would be admitting that I was the same as that. And that was very hard for me. Um, but, eventually, you know, things, things would go on. We would have kids, we would get married. I would tell you
We would
from,
get married first, and then
yes, yes.
anyone that doesn't know us, we did it in that order, got married,
Yeah, yeah,
and then
yeah.
had our children.
Yeah. But basically, I remember I wanted to start writing, and there's lots of different points I could talk about, but for the sake of time, I remember I wanted to start writing down my childhood story, and I really wanted to write about my father. And I ended up writing about my mom, which was like so bizarre. I sat down to write a book on faith, fatherhood, and family. And I ended up writing all this about my growing up in my mom's house. And I remember as I started doing that, my eyes started twitching, and my eye was twitching all day long, nonstop. And then I remember I woke up in the morning one day and I looked at my teeth and it looked like one of my teeth were chipped. And I'm like, when did I bump I don't remember bumping my tooth, you know? And maybe like a week later, I had this headache, this migraine lasted for like a week. It started in my shoulders, went up my head, went down my shoulders. And it was I've had migraines my whole life, but it was so intense. I couldn't understand what was going on. And then, I was in a meeting one day here at the office, and in the middle of the meeting, like half my tooth broke off.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I was like, I got up, didn't say anything, just walked out of the room. Our dentist is like 5 minutes from the office. We have a great relationship with them, so just drove right over there. I walked in, I was like, my tooth fell off, and they immediately put a crown on my tooth right then and there. They fixed it, And they're like, what? I'm like, what do you think happened? They said, you're grinding your teeth at night. And I was grinding my teeth so much because of the stress of and another part of the story was that I started reading autobiographies about people who lived traumatic lives, and you would read them too.
So this is when I began, I think, to first realize what you were up against that I did not have an understanding of. And we were probably 10, 11, maybe 12 years into marriage, and had both kids, had settled back here in Birmingham, not back, but settled here in Birmingham, been here a few years. And on the outside, everything was great, and really have a non-stressful job. We are so blessed in what we do, where it's ministry and it's serving pastors and it's serving leaders and church planners specifically. But it's in the most life-giving environment that I could ever describe to you. So I'm trying to set it up. There's not work stress. There's not life stress with our children at the time or anything like that. But someone recommended an autobiography, Glass Castle is what it's called. And you were reading it and you read it, and then I read it. And it was one of the situations, again, as an Enneagram 7, I read it and I basically had to read it in 12 hours. I read it in a 12-hour sitting because I had to get to the end where I knew this woman would be okay. She was at least okay enough to write an autobiography. And so I needed to know that she survived this childhood. And so after reading it, of course, we talked about it, and I was like, telling these moments of, gosh, I cannot believe she went through this. And then you said to me, you were like, well, that was my childhood. And
that's
you
no big deal. I didn't realize when she was writing the stuff in the book, The Glass Castle, that this was supposed to be alarming to other people. I'm like, that's exactly how I grew up. I mean, I thought I was like, yeah, I get it.
Josh pointed to specific examples that she cites of when she was 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, early elementary, teenage. And I remember doing this, I remember this at my grandparents' house with my mom or with my dad or this. Mm-hmm. And that is the first
and you have the photos to prove it.
Yeah, no, that is okay. That is the first time that I understood your childhood fully.
And I'll give one example here. So she talks about cooking in boiling water and hurting herself.
Because she was 3 years old.
She was 3 years old.
And she had pulled a stool up. She wasn't going to get
There's
to eat.
There's photos of me and my brother at that age cooking. And so I have it's so crazy how similar it is. But I remember one day my grandfather would cook, eggs in the morning. And it was so normal for me to be at the stove that nobody stopped me. I pulled up a chair when he was finished, climbed up the chair. And when he turned the burner off, the coils went black. And something in my head thought, I wonder if it's still hot. even though it's black and not red. And I took my hand and I just put it right on the burner full on. It had the coils burned into my hand. Um, but yeah, and so what happened is reading that brought back memories, discussion, writing about it brought back things that I've never felt like I've tried to hide anything from myself or anybody else, but it just started coming to the surface. And then watching my kids go through the same age that I was.
Years even before that, a counselor had told me something that about another situation, not about me, not about you, but this, in a pastoral situation, a counselor had said something to me that clicked in my mind when this was all going on. And that is that as your kids grow, that when your kids begin to reach the age of when some of your most traumatic experiences were in your childhood, that can oftentimes, it doesn't cause depression, anxiety, or a struggle for somebody, but it can trigger it in a sense to the surface where
Yes.
they're aware of it. And I think we saw that as our oldest Sophie began to get to an age in elementary school where I think some of you had some vivid childhood memories of yourself at that age.
And she would have experiences and I would remember mine and how the difference was. And then, gosh, there's so much here. But basically another thing that happened was I started having these crazy chest pains.
Yes.
I was doing basically CrossFit. It's called Iron Tribe. I was training for a marathon. I was leading a Highlands College small group. We were leading a survey project with 150 people. I was writing my blog every day. I was trying to get published in articles. I was working on a book. We were doing our thing for ARC. We were leading a mission trip to New York City. And one day I went to prayer. I was reading like 4 books at the same time because I was reading a book.
You were trying to accomplish and achieve something.
And I was reading a book with Sophie, reading a book for enjoyment, reading a book, learning about leadership, reading a book, learning about writing. And one day I went to prayer and somebody texted me about their wedding. And it was a commitment that I had to go to. And when they did, my chest started hurting really bad. And I started having these crazy chest pains. And then the main thing, though, was, gosh, and we're just way over on time on this. But the main thing is, I had something happen at work. I had a bad day at work, basically. And ARC asked me, like, hey, what would you like to do, to work on this? And I was like, I'd really like to go see a counselor. And so they helped me get connected with the counselor. And part of it was like, you went, not because there's anything wrong with you, but just as a support to help me. And we learned a lot of stuff, like the Geneogram and different things that really helped me out. But it was really brought a lot of stuff to the surface. And as we're driving back home, we get a call, and I won't go into detail about it, that one of our kids had a disability. And I always kind of pride myself on being able to like overcome anything. I always felt like it's like a superpower, that I could never be discouraged. But knowing that she would suffer in some way and that there's nothing I could do to stop it or control it, it was like the first time in my life where I felt like I couldn't overcome something. And I remember walking through Lowe's one day, and I'm trying not to get emotional talking about it. And it's like, I'm going to keep going. Life's good. Life's good. And then I went into the garden center, and it was like a darkness just came into me. And it was just like, I can't do anything about this. I can't change this. I can't stop it, and like, there's such a big part of my story that there came a point where I realized I would never have the family that I wanted, but I would create that.
You're talking about, you realize that you can't go back and change your childhood. You can't change dynamics that happened between your parents.
Right.
And the results of what all that meant for your life. But you can get married, have your own family, and create a legacy, a new legacy.
Right.
And that is true. But,
right.
But when you realize you didn't really have control of that either.
Right. And that I was like, I can't be the lucky one, right? Because I don't have a disability, she has to be the lucky one. I'm doing this for her. And the fact that she would not be able to thrive in some way, gosh, it ruined me. And that's when it just collapsed on me.
That's the first time that your depression, anxiety, and any sort of mental health struggle became apparent to me.
Yeah.
That is when it was like, oh, there's something going on here.
And so
we need to get you help.
Yeah. And so the day I went to the doctor, it was the same day Anthony Bourdain died by suicide.
The chef. Yep. Okay.
So that was like on the news, on the TV, in the doctor's office, and people were posting about it. And that's when I got medicine for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
and I thought, oh, this is just temporary. And she said, do you deal with depression? I'm like, no, I'm the happiest person I know. That's literally what I said. I said, nobody loves
Well,
life
it's
more than
funny
me.
because for a while you were just like, oh, I'm dealing with a little bit of anxiety. That's why that
that's
you
how I
use
coded
that
it.
word. Yes.
And that's
Even
how
to me, you would only use that word.
Right. And I hid it. I hid the
Mhm.
fact. So when I
Mhm.
went to the doctor, I said, I deal with anxiety, maybe a little depression, but anxiety, oh, my chest.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I kind of like let it, like, just want depression, but it's the anxiety. I'm taking this medicine for my anxiety. And then I remember when it kicked in,
It's true.
and the first morning that it kicked in, I was woke up on a Sunday morning and I was singing, this is the day that the Lord has made. The Lord has
Oh, I'm
made.
sorry, I didn't
I
know.
will rejoice
I will rejoice
and be glad in it.
and be glad in it.
And I
I
was
don't
walking
sing,
around
so.
and I was just thinking, man, I don't think I've ever been this happy in my life. What a great Sunday. And I just like, girls, wake up. We're going to church.
How long have you been on the medicine at that point?
About 4 weeks.
Okay.
And I was like, what is this magical feeling? And then I realized, oh, the medicine is working.
Because it takes a little while to kick in.
To metabolize it. So it was
Mhm.
kicking in.
Mhm.
And then sadness, it's so funny, but sadness came right after that because I'm like, wait, is this how everyone gets to start their day? Just,
You're thinking this is how people feel.
yeah, I never felt that way.
Yeah.
And I was like, everyone gets to start out at here. I'm starting down here every day.
Mhm.
It just didn't seem fair. Eventually, that medicine
Mhm.
was not working. Took it for a while, and it started having. That's the problem with some of these medicines, is they actually create some of the same symptoms. And when that happens, you got to switch. And so I switched to this brand new drug that just came out called Trintellix. And
If I could time out and just say one thing here, if you're listening and you're like, man, I don't even realize that maybe there is some things that I'm dealing with, and could it be depression? Could it be anxiety? It's so important to work with your medical provider, your doctor, in conjunction with a mental health professional, both, because there is medicine that your doctor, your actual general practitioner
yep.
doctor was prescribing. But then when you were working in conjunction with your mental health professional, your psychologist,
I went to a psychologist,
and when all of those pieces began to connect, that's when we really began to see the traction. It takes work. It takes time. Rarely is the very first thing that is tried is maybe the right thing for you. So it's going to take some trial and error. It's going to take some time. And then
even when I started with my new medicine, it wasn't.
The
was
dosage
troubles
is
at
right.
first.
There's got to be
lots
the
of trouble at first. So yeah, it was crazy. I would drive down the road like, oh, all of a sudden I felt like I have to vomit. I have to pull over the street and relieve myself. I guess I'll put it in a politer way. And that was the medicine. It was messing things up, and I had to get on track. It's working great, and I've continued on it. And I've this really needs to be probably
needs to be a
two-parter, but we'll wrap it up.
And it doesn't. It's not a cure-all. It's part of the puzzle. It's part of it, and it's not for everybody even, but it's part of the puzzle. It's part of the answer. It's part of what is the bigger picture of what's working for you. Well, I think what we're learning as we're doing this is that it's impossible to talk about all this in one episode. So why don't we make this 2 episodes? I think that would be a great thing, to make this a 2-part episode. And in this first part, covering more just that journey of even realizing that, hey, I'm in ministry, I'm married, I love my life, I love my family, I love where I live, I love the work I get to do every day, but I am struggling with depression. And to see, like, wait a minute, even I can be doing all the right things spiritually, praying, reading my Bible, attending church, active in church community. You reference, leading small groups and missions trips and all of these things in community with church family and friends, but still battling this. That just the realization of that, for me, the realization of that was even possible. And that, hey, I thought we broke those generational curses, off our life, even as we began to talk about your family history, and that became apparent to both of us, your family history and how it affected you and what you faced in childhood. It's like, wait, but we broke those curses, and we have victory and we have overcome. but there was still more that we would journey on to discover, to really gain traction in dealing with depression. And I think that's what we're going to cover in part 2 of this episode.
Yes, we'll do that part 2. And I guess one thing I just want to highlight before we end this is that I'm talking about my childhood. The thing about it was I loved my childhood. That's the crazy part, is that when we were talking about this, even back in 2018,
Yes.
it wasn't that I was like blaming my parents for anything.
No, never. That was never your stance.
But it's wheat and tares for sure. It's a mix. There was love and there was dysfunction, and there was neglect and there was abuse, and it came in different ways from different parts of the family. And there was support. It was such a mixed bag. And so,
and I think what we realized,
I think the reason why I say
is that people in your family were doing the best that they could with what they were given based on what they had even experienced in their own childhood.
Yeah.
I know you shared about your dad.
Yeah, my dad would say that. My dad would say, "Hey, we're standing on the shoulders of and you'll do better than me because I did better than my dad, who did better than his,
Right.
But so the reason why I say that though is because you don't have to have like this crazy story to be impacted by trauma.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so let's talk about that next week. We will go ahead and wrap this up, and next week we'll talk about getting traction with depression, and we'll go over some things that I've learned. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Believe Again podcast, powered by Parable. We want to thank our sponsor, Parable Church Accounting, Bookkeeping, and Strategic Services. Parable helps you place every dollar on mission, telling the story of His kingdom. Find out more at liveyourparable.com/believeagain. And make sure to let them know you heard about them from the Believe Again podcast. You get 25% off your onboarding fees. We hope you found this episode inspiring and valuable. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to share it with a friend who could use some encouragement. Be sure to follow us on Instagram for updates and more inspiration throughout the week. And if you're loving the show, we'd appreciate if you could rate us wherever you get your podcast. Your support helps us reach even more leaders with encouragement that they need. Until next time, keep believing and leading strong.